Okay. Not a huge fan of reading, but for those of you that know me, I'm not very good at staying on task. So I will read my paper. So prior to becoming a lecturer at Liverpool Hope, I spent almost 20 years working alongside people who are said to have learning difficulties. Half of that time in social work and the other half in speech and hearing therapy. Both of these roles gave me the opportunity to work alongside children and adults who are described as having profound and multiple learning difficulties, which is typically shortened to PMLD. While I find this term problematic for many reasons, it's in keeping with the discourse of education, health and social care, and because I hope that my work will be of interest to people in these fields, I'll continue to make use of it for now. A couple of years back, I was developing some new teaching material for our undergraduate students on the subject of PMLD, and having previously taught with Professor Peter Clough and used with students some of his semi-fictionalised stories of boys said to have social emotional behaviour difficulties, I embarked on writing stories of my own about events in my professional practice that had left me wondering about what we claim to know about children described as having PMLD, wondering why I felt unhappy with these explanations, and wondering whether there were other ways of thinking the lives of children said to have PMLD. By way of an introduction then, what I hope I'm providing is an easier read summary. So in this presentation, I'm going to be saying that there are different ways of thinking about children described as having PMLD. Some people don't think that children said to have PMLD have a voice because they don't use speech. That I've been reading books by two French men called Deleuze and Guattari, and they have helped me to think about voice differently. And that there are ways of writing with children said to have PMLD, like writing stories that can show that they do have a voice. Okay. Before moving into the first part of my presentation, I'd like to start with the author whose work I referred to in my abstract. When reading back what I had written, I was left feeling a little uncomfortable with, and that I'd cast him, Vorhaus, as a researcher who took a typical reductionist approach to thinking about people said to have PMLD. He doesn't. I do believe that in his book, Giving Voice to Profound Disability, that it is indeed what he is doing. I enjoy how he questions concepts like personhood, dependence, agency and capability, but where our ideas depart from each other's is on what constitutes as voice. And it's my thoughts on this that I'd like to share with you today. These are just my thoughts though. I offer no clear argument as one might expect from a paper in this series. My paper is an assemblage of thoughts, feelings, readings, experiences, writing, me, children, classrooms, teachers, PMLD and French philosophers. I have, you'll be pleased to hear, however, tried to map something out that shows the connections between these things and my thinking. Like Deleuze and Guattari, I'm not interested in making meaning, but do seek to know how things work and what they produce. Before problematizing traditional conceptions of voice as it relates to children said to have PMLD, I shall briefly highlight what these conceptions are for those less familiar with the PMLD literature. Typical definitions of PMLD often make reference to the very low IQ, usually below 20, and the presence of more than one impairment. They also often include statements about children possessing very limited communication skills. And an example here by Mansell 2010 suggests that people with PMLD have great difficulty communicating. They typically have very limited understanding and express themselves through non-verbal means, or at most through a few words or symbols. They often show limited evidence of intention. Throughout my professional career, I would regularly use communication assessments of individuals who are said to have PMLD. And I've just got one on the slide at the moment. So what I'm showing there is a fairly typical, very linear, supposedly developmental assessment that I might have used on someone said to have PMLD. So looking first for things like pre-intentional behaviours. So this idea then that that when babies are first born, they don't necessarily cry because they know that it can affect the adult to feed them. They just cry. Yeah, it's just purely voluntary. And a lot of children with PMLD are said to be communicating at that level. I then might look for other kind of voluntary behaviours that someone might use, again not necessarily with an intention of getting someone else to do something. I might look at other unconventional communication. So here someone might have learnt to be intentional in their communication. But they're using perhaps something unusual like a body movement in order to communicate something. And then moving through, and here we then generally get on to parts of communication that children described as having PMLD are often said not to have. So more conventional communication using pre-symbolic behaviours, concrete symbols, abstract symbols, putting 2 or 3 abstract symbols together, etc. The consequence of conceptualising voice in such narrow, systematic, linear and bounded ways is that children said to have PMLD are then perceived as severely lacking voice and lacking agency. It's positive to see that there has at least been a move away from the idea of the non-verbal child, which is how children said to have PMLD have traditionally been described. For example, Lawson et al. Here argue that the concept of voice needs a much broader interpretation than speaking, as many learners with PMLD use other modes of communication. So they talk about total communication in terms of things like use of photographs or objects of reference or symbols, etc. There remains, however, a tendency to conceptualise voice as emanating from a single essentialist subject. And we privilege this notion of the voice because we assume that it can speak the truth of consciousness and experience. But I'm not convinced. I want to share a slightly shorter version of the story that brought me to this research, a story I simply call Karen. It's based on my memories of a moment I had with a 12-year-old girl described as having PMLD. We were engaged in an activity called intensive interaction, commonly used with children who are thought to be communicating at an early pre-speech level. The approach is based on the interaction between an adult and a baby during the first year of their life and works on encouraging intentionality, shared attention and skills like eye contact and turn taking. Hiya Joe, you're right. So Karen. I entered the classroom a little later than usual after a 3-week break to find Karen in her usual position, slumped down in a plastic armchair with her legs wrapped around the back of her neck. As I said good morning, her legs started to slowly unfold. She let out a loud as if to say, "What time do you call this?" "Oh dear, are you cross with me because I'm a bit late, or is it because I've been away for a few weeks?" Karen can spend very lengthy spells with her legs crossed behind the back of her neck, and as such it can take a bit of time to unravel. As her face is gently uncovered, I can see that she's grinning widely. Her cheeks are damp and quite red. She looks how I sometimes look when I've just woken up. I watch her untangling her agile little legs, thinking how much my legs ache when I've sat with them crossed for a while and then straighten them out again. "Good morning, did you think I wasn't coming?" Okay, I said I'm sorry. Karen grabs the side of my shirt and starts hoisting her tiny, nimble body to her feet. I lightly place my arms around her waist so that she doesn't topple over. I sit down on the sticky plastic chair and gently move her leg so that she's leaning against my legs so she's less wobbly. Karen presses her soggy chin on my forehead. Ah! I place my chin on Karen's shoulder. Ah! Karen says, ah! I reply, ah! I'm generally not a person who enjoys having their personal space invaded, but it doesn't bother me with Karen. She rests her right cheek against my right cheek. I reply, Are you not going to swing on my hair today, I ask. Usually Karen hangs on both sides of my hair and bounces up and down whilst first giving one, which I repeat, then two, then three. When tired of that game, she then usually collapses down on my knee and taps the top of her leg with the side of her hand, and I repeat the number of taps on her opposite leg. She lightly cups my face and puts her face near my right ear. I reply, She was being unusually gentle today. Are you tired or feeling a bit out of sorts? The gentleness is making me feel quite choked up. Can you tell I'm feeling a bit sad today, I ask. It wasn't easy coming back to work today. Indeed, my manager had questioned whether I needed to take a bit more time out following the quite unexpected death of my mum. But I actually can't think of a more sensitive person to spend the first part of the day with. I don't have to run through the story of what happened, and there's no awkward, nobody knows what to say moments with Karen. Tss. Oh, that's a new sound. Tss. Karen's now slumped down into my lap and has the right side of her face resting on my right shoulder. I feel my shirt soaking up her saliva. I bet you miss your dad, don't you? Karen had suddenly lost her father only 2 months ago. Do you know that I've lost my mum? Is that why you're being so gentle? Tss. Tss, I reply. Are we having a sad moment together? Karen's twirling some of my hair with her right hand. Tss. Sonia's ready when you are, Laura, yelled Margaret. The shared moment's broken. I need to go and chat with Sonia now, Karen. Sorry to have to move on so quickly, but thanks for being so kind and understanding today. I carefully lift Karen back into her chair where she immediately slouches down and starts the slow process of moving her feet to behind her head again. I go over to the speech therapy file on the table and record. Karen appeared a bit subdued today. New sound. Tss. Repetition game. Only Laura copying Karen. I've captured nothing of that moment. Whilst working in speech and hearing therapy, I frequently found myself telling parents and teachers that their child's comprehension was no more than perhaps recognising a few familiar people or concrete objects in context, because that's what the literature sold me as a truth. And not a week went by when a parent or carer wouldn't say, you know, they understand everything I say to them, I can just tell. Which I, in my professional wisdom, knew could not be possible with an IQ below 20. But in that moment with Karen, I heard her voice. Not the voice of a singular subject emitting appropriate words to express her sympathy for my loss and to tell me that she felt the same when she lost her dad. But I heard her. For those, and researchers have been describing these feelings encountered by people connected to individuals said to have PMLD for decades. Back in the 1980s, Bogdan and Taylor asked a mother how she knew her daughter understands, to which she replied, it's just something inside me. I really believe that deep in my soul. And a little later in the 1990s, Good discussed how parents and others in close relationships with people labelled with PMLD said that they just know what the other person's thinking and feeling. In order to understand what forces might be at work here, I turn to my dear friends Deleuze and Qatari, who usually have something to say in response to many of my questions. For those unfamiliar with Deleuze and Guattari, for sometimes I draw on Deleuze as solo work and at sometimes their joint work. Their central concern is that modernity has been a period in history that has been dominated by an explosion of normalising discourses and institutions that permeate every aspect of our social being. Their theories are framed around their rejection of the idea that there is a fixed and unified identity, and they offer new ways of thinking about a human existence that is, as Gatton says, free to become dispersed and multiple, reconstituted as new types of subjectivities and bodies. They've offered much to disability studies in the last couple of decades as scholars in the discipline have looked for other theoretical resources to develop their work, to develop their ideas. Their work has assisted us in thinking about bodies beyond the binaries and enabled us to confront some of the totalising meta-narratives produced because of the progress of science. For me, the work of Deleuze and Guattari has made it possible to conceptualise the lives of children said to have PMLD in much more creative ways. As Staggold summarises, they hold that lived experience comprises particularity and uniqueness in each moment, experience and individual, the inherent differences of which ought always to be acknowledged. By positing the concept over the particular, thinking of the arboreal kind abstracts from lived experience in its very structure. For Deleuze and Guattari, thinking in such a way stifles creativity, leaves superior concepts relatively immune to criticism, and tends to close one's mind to the dynamism, particularity and change that is evident in lived experience. I'd like to spend the next part of the presentation thinking with one of their ideas, the body without organs. The body without organs does not equate literally to an organless body. As Colebrook states, Deleuze and Guattari have interrogated the genesis of many organised bodies, including bodies of humans, but also of societies, of art, of philosophy and science, and moved to the body without organs, or the forces from which bodies are composed. What Deleuze and Guattari are opposed to are the organising principles that structure, define and speak on behalf of any collective assemblage. They argue that rather than slotting everything into polarised fields of the norm and its opposite, the poles of organisation should be removed. The assemblage doesn't collapse completely because the body without organs exists within stratified fields of organisation, so it cannot break away entirely from the system that it seeks to escape from. As Parr contends, while it seeks a mode of articulation that is free from the binding tropes of subjectification and signification, it must play a delicate game of maintaining some reference to these systems of stratification, or else risk obliteration or reterritorialisation back into these systems. The body without organs allows us to think about how different kinds of bodies become organised, rather than thinking of them as static, already organised wholes. We can use this idea to think about the concept of voice for children said to have PMLD, and how the idea of voice has become organised, and organised in such a reductive way. Just have a wee drink.
I was going to suggest you drink.
Oh, thank you, darling. Got a cup of char here. Thanks, Joe. Lisa Metze, who's just one of my favourite authors of the moment, in a 2013 paper put forward the idea of a voice without organs in order to rethink how narrative data in post-qualitative research might be analysed. She proposed that the voice without organs is a voice that doesn't emanate from a singular subject, but is produced in an enactment among research data participants and analysis. It's a voice that is not bound by speech, but can be found in inhabited silence, words that seemed present in their absence. I love this idea, words that seem present in their absence. It's like when Deleuze in his work on cinema said that silent films are not silent, they're just noiseless. These ideas seem to connect with some of my own thoughts about the complexity of voice as it relates to children said to have PMLD. From a practitioner's point of view, we have a very narrow conception of communication that we privilege, a conception that has been organised mainly by knowledge claims that derive from developmental psychology, a discipline which for me is too keen to reduce difference and repetition to marks of an underlying sameness. If we were to try and imagine voice without some of the organising poles that developmental psychology has provided us, verbal, non-verbal, intentional, pre-intentional, symbolic, pre-symbolic, then it opens up the possibility for us to conceptualise it as something much more dynamic and fluid, something that is not produced by a singular subject, and something that is not separate to the enactment in which it is produced. An enactment that is an entanglement of human and non-human agents in that particular moment. To assist us in thinking about a voice without organs, it's necessary to also consider Deleuze and Guattari's ideas on agency, because traditional readings are based on a humanist perspective, where agency is seen as an innate characteristic of the essentialist intentional free subject that enables her to act on and in the world. As Metze 2013 contends, to ascribe agency to someone is to imply that she is a voluntary actor, making choices that are willed rather than determined. From a Deleuze-Guattarian paradigm, however, the agency of the subject, according to Pierre 2000, seems to lie in the subject's ability to decode and recode its identity within discursive formations and cultural practices. You see, in Deleuze-Guattarian ontology, there is no present conscious coherent individual who, as Maclaire puts it, knows who she is, says what she means, and means what she says. Thus we decouple voice, word spoken, from an intentional, agentic, humanist subject and move to a voice without organs. Voice thought as an assemblage, a complex network of human and non-human agents that exceeds the traditional notion of the individual. This body, Laura, is not a subject, not an individual person with innate agency who speaks with a singular voice. You cannot separate my voice out from my social environment and all of its forces in this moment. What counts as voice is dictated, therefore, not by an individual subject, but by the systems of significance that determine what makes sense to a given situation. What I and other researchers such as Simmons, Watson, Macheka are attempting to do is to challenge the current systems of significance, systems that fail to provide meaning to voice and agency as it relates to Karen. When Karen leaks out of the bounded description of PMLD, where are the systems of significance to make sense of that? What the voice without organs has shown me is that just because we have previously not had a system of significance to account for Karen's voice does not mean that it's not real. After all, the very reliance on our received vocabularies predetermines to some extent what we're able to consider. But as Barrett cautions, this should not be an invitation to turn everything into words, but is instead a contestation of the excessive power granted to language to determine what is real. I was able to find the voice without organs by writing stories. When embarking on my research, it was necessary to find a means of exploring PMLD that eluded humanism's attempt to order what I felt could not be contained. As law reminds us, reality is messy, and methodologies that seek to convert this mess into something smooth, coherent and precise both miss out on particular textures of life and tend to make a mess of what it does seek to understand because it fails to take account of complexity. Creative analytical practices come in many forms, and these are just a few that are discussed in Denson and Lincoln's bumper book of qualitative inquiry on my head of department shelf. So things like autoethnography, fiction, poetry, sorry, someone here interested in poetry, layered text, epistles, visual text, museum displays, choreograph findings, performance pieces, etc. As someone who enjoys telling stories to my students and anyone else who'll listen, then story writing was an obvious choice. In creative analytical practices, the writing process and the writing product are deeply intertwined, and both are privileged. The product cannot be separated from the producer, the mode of production, or the method of knowing. As Richardson and St. Pierre argue, writing as a method of inquiry has become a viable way of learning about ourselves, our research participants, and the research topic. Indeed, it's argued that this species of writing adapts to the kind of world that we inhabit, a world of uncertainty. That's a quote by Richardson and St. Pierre. By storying Karen, I was able to think about voice that exists outside, in between, and within the discursive and material. The excessive voice that escapes containment. I hope to have exposed her lines of flight and revealed the voice without organs by showing her to be the multiple, dispersed, fragmented, complex and contradictory human that she is. And in doing so, it's hoped that I can challenge the overly reductive understanding of voice as it relates to children said to have PMLD, and the intellectual paralysis that exists in thinking of voice. I must confess that posthumanism, while it excites me, simultaneously makes me feel anxious. I have no problem in confessing that I find it tough to get my head around. I've been sleeping with Deleuze and Guattari for 4 years now, and I still barely know them. Just like to say I don't have a habit of sleeping with people that I barely know. But it is the lack of certainty and my ineptness at being able to imagine the post-human that is difficult. But I gain some comfort from my friends Giles and Felix when they state that dismantling the organism never meant killing yourself, but rather opening the body to connections that presuppose an entire assemblage. You have to keep enough of the organism for it to reform each dawn. You don't reach the body without organs by wildly destratifying. If you free it with too violent an action, if you blow apart the strata without taking precautions, then you will be killed, plunged into a black hole, or even dragged towards catastrophe. Staying stratified, organised, signified, subjected is not the worst that can happen. The worst that can happen is if you throw the strata into demented or suicidal collapse, which bring them back down as even heavier than before.